Imagine this scenario. You are arguing with a friend about basketball and they start to use facts that are just quite frankly untrue. No matter how many times you try to convince them, they continue to go back to the same old overused, misinformed social media arguments that are commonplace on Facebook, or X as they call it now, but have no basis in reality. These arguments are no more common than when discussing players that played anything longer than 20 years ago. The favorite argument made by trolls online who support LeBron over Jordan, for example, is Jordan played against plumbers and firemen. And this argument, along with many others, gets used more and more often the further back in time we go. That's how we land on the topic for today, Wilt Chamberlain. Wilt, as pretty much everyone knows, is the most statistically absurd player to ever play in the NBA. The man has so many records to this day that it's near impossible to count, and just as many detractors who try to discount all the man's achievements for various reasons. Today, I'm going to dive into the most common misconceptions about Wilt so everyone can have proper context when debating where he should be amongst the NBA greats. Wilt played against plumbers. The argument is always some variation of, no one was as big as Wilt back then, there was like 2 other guys who were 6'9", then the rest of the league were 6'3" white guys who worked as insert manual labor job in the off season. Which is one of the worst arguments I've ever heard. I'm going to assume that these misconceptions stem from a number of sources. For example, it's widely known that in the early days of sports, especially baseball, a lot of the players did work secondary jobs because there was no money in the game yet. That is true. However, by the time the 60s had rolled around in the NBA, sports salaries were already starting to climb. The average pay in 1960 for an NBA player was $15,000, or after this absurd inflation we've been having, $150,000 in the modern day. Now, that's nowhere near the $100 million contracts the players make today, but it's still a really good living. I mean, much more than most normal jobs of that era, and you were living quite comfortably if you were in the league. Zero necessity to go out and work a second job. If you were in the NBA, you could spend all your time on your game if you wanted, as they all made plenty enough money to do it. Another reason this myth came about is there was a lot of players in this era who truthfully were regular looking white dudes. I mean, as good as some of them were, Bob Cousy and Jerry West, for example. What people aren't taking into account though is those weren't the guys that were guarding Wilt, and those weren't the guys Wilt was guarding. The average height of the NBA right now is 6'7", and the average height of the NBA in 1962 was 6'6". It has been one of those 2 numbers every year since. Now, looking at just centers, the average center height in 1962, which is, just so you're aware, the same year Wilt averaged 50, was 6'10 and a half. Now, it's 6'11. There's virtually no difference between the heights of the players back then to the heights of players now. And then after that, you'll hear, okay, but even if the players were just as tall, they were all rail thin and really weak, so they couldn't guard Wilt, who was huge. This is another desperate attempt for them to salvage their argument. For one, being thin doesn't equal weak. Just look at Wilt himself, for example. Before his Lakers years, he didn't have that much weight or mass to him, and yet he was incredibly strong. Now let's look at every single one of the starting centers in the year Wilt averaged 50 to see if they were truly rail thin, weak, and smaller than him. Firstly, you have Bill Russell of the Celtics, who was 6'10". Then you have Swede Holbrook of the Nationals, who was 7'3". Daryl Imhoff of the Knicks, who was 6'10". This was the guy he scored 100 on, by the way. Ray Felix of the Lakers, who was 6'11". Wayne Embry of the Royals, who was admittedly only 6'8", but he was built like a truck. Walter Dukes of the Pistons, who was 7 foot. For the Hawks, Clyde Levelette and Bob Pettit both rotated the center spot, both were 6'9", and both were Hall of Famers. Finally, Walt Bellamy of the Chicago Packers, who was 6'11". That was the entire extent of the centers that started in the NBA in 1962, the year that Wilt averaged 50 points a game. Also, all measurements were barefoot back then, and they wear shoes now, so add about an inch to maybe an inch and a half to each. Then you look further into Wilt's career, and he faced off against other great bigs such as Nate Thurmond, Kareem, and Artis Gilmore, and that's just to name a few. I mean, there's not much else to say about this argument. Wilt played guys just as big and strong as players are today. He was just better. Modern players are more athletic. Now, on average, I agree with this actually. Players today have access to more resources to train targeted assets such as vertical leap and lateral quickness. I just don't think this argument takes into account the whole picture. Firstly, the NBA is still not average. Consider this. I'm sure everyone is aware of some individual who was just a gifted athlete. A guy who never went to the gym and never played organized sports, but could dunk with ease and was incredibly fast. These types of people didn't just come into existence in the past 20 to 30 years. There were people like that in the 60s too, guys that just had pure natural talent. Consider Gus Johnson, a 6'6" small forward, power forward from Wilt's era who, again, didn't have access to modern training, was claimed by numerous people to be able to dunk from around the free throw line. Or Elgin Baylor, who was dunking on guys of regularity. Bill Russell, who of course was an extreme athlete, see this clip of him jumping over a guy on a fast break for reference, also was one of the highest rated high jumpers in the country at the time he played. And I could go on and on of different players who were like this from that era. Yes, Wilt was more athletic than all of them as a whole, but he's more athletic than any big today as well. The big men back then were just as physically equipped to stop Wilt, and it just couldn't be done. The man was 7'1", and he ran track at Kansas. He had a sub 11 second 100 meter dash, a 49 second 400, a sub 2 minute 800, and won the Big 8 championship in the high jump. This is what we call a once in a lifetime athlete. This is before modern training as well. I mean, there is no 7-footer in the NBA doing this even now, and no one today could match Wilt's pure athletic and physical talent. There were less teams in the NBA back then. Yes, this is true, but I don't see how this can be used as an argument against players back then. It just means that the NBA had far less diluted talent than it does now. If there was only 8 teams today, you'd have guys who are considered solid starters / role players sitting at the end of the bench, and most current bench players would be out of the league. Now, like I've said, on average, players are better now, and there weren't as many really good players that were outside of the league as there would be now if the league was only 8 teams. But at the same time, I'm always of the mindset that generational talent is generational talent no matter what era. And there's always a handful of guys who are gifted enough to be a superstar in any day and age. Fact of the matter, 8 teams, in theory, should have made the NBA harder for Wilt, not easier. Wilt's numbers are inflated, as everyone put up crazy numbers back then. Yes, they are inflated. If Wilt was born in the modern day and played today, he would not put up 50 and 25 a game. The game was paced differently back then, and play styles gave the possibility of crazy stat lines. That being said, no one was even close to what Wilt was doing statistically back then, and he would absolutely still put up crazy numbers if he grew up today, just maybe not as crazy. Now, let's look at points per game leaders today versus back then. If it were so easy to put up great scoring numbers, we should see at least a couple other players from Wilt's era putting up at least like high 30s, low 40s a game, right? No, we don't. In fact, we see 5 players in 1962 who averaged over 30, including Wilt. The others were Walt Bellamy at 31.6, Bob Pettit at 31.1, Oscar Robertson at 30.8, and Jerry West at 30.8. All of them considered great players and Hall of Famers. In the 2022-23 season, we have 6 guys who averaged over 30, and the leader, Joel Embiid, only averaged around a point more than the guy in second, Luka. Wilt averaged nearly 20 points more a game than any other player back then. He was just unmatched, even when it comes to other legends as far as scoring. I will concede that one stat that is really inflated from that era is rebounding, as Wilt, Russell, Bellamy, and Pettit all averaged over 18 rebounds a game, which is way more than the top players for today. The league's leader today, Sabonis, would have been 10th in 1962, right behind point guard Oscar Robertson. I'm not saying someone like Wilt or Russell wouldn't lead the NBA in rebounding today, because I think they probably would, but it would look a lot more like 13 to 15 a game instead of 22 to 25 a game. LeBron would score 100 a game in that era. LeBron would be great in that era because he's a generational talent. Like I've said numerous times, generational talents prevail almost certainly no matter what. Would he score 100 points a game or some nonsense like that? No, of course not. If you're talking about picking up modern LeBron, I'm putting him in that league. 1, he has the benefit of modern training and learning moves from previous generations that players back then didn't have the luxury of having, so it's not a valid comparison to begin with. And secondly, 95% of LeBron's moveset would be illegal in the 60s. The game rules were totally different with how they enforced things. If LeBron had been born in the 40s and played in the 60s, which I think is the proper way to make the case, he would have a much less modern moveset, but he'd still be an athletic freak of nature. Probably would be similar to like a bigger Oscar Robertson in the era, and would put up phenomenal numbers. Would he be putting up Wilt's 1962 stat line of 50 points and 25 rebounds a game? I personally have my doubts on that. But that, of course, is just me theorizing. The only other player that was on his level was Bill Russell, and he dominated Wilt. So this was covered slightly in the plumbers section of the video, but there's some other things we need to discuss here to break it down a bit more. We've established that Bill Russell was not the only other good big man in that era. I would argue that in Wilt's best season, even Walt Bellamy had a better year than Bill Russell did production-wise, though not team success-wise. He averaged over 10 more points a game on significantly better efficiency from the field and nearly the same amount of rebounds. Bill was obviously great though, and easily was Wilt's closest match throughout the 60s. Did he actually dominate Wilt though? Well, I suppose that depends on how you define dominate. The Celtics dominated Wilt's teams, that is true. However, the Celtics dynasty was stacked beyond belief. Just in 1962, they rostered 8 players who would go on to be in the Hall of Fame, and almost all of them were in their primes. Wilt played with 5 surprisingly that season, but only one was still in his prime, that being Paul Reason. The rest of them were well past their best. The Celtics were a genuine super team, and there was probably like 7 players on their roster who would be either the second or third best on Wilt's team. It's no wonder he could never beat them. It's a team game, and Wilt was just one guy. What about the one-on-one matchups? Well, Bill did not dominate those, quite the opposite in fact. Wilt frequently torched Russell, but Russell admittedly was better at winning than Wilt, made more clutch plays, and had, like I mentioned, a better team around him. That's why he triumphed. In 1962, Wilt played Russell 17 times. While playing Russell, who was one of the greatest defenders of all time, Wilt still averaged 37 points a game. Less than versus other players in the league, sure, but still an astronomical number. Russell was never shutting down Wilt, maybe slowing him down, sure, which is all that it took for that insane Celtics team to win, but that isn't on Wilt. In conclusion, most of the arguments that people go to minimize Wilt's ability are misinformed at best and dishonest at worst. There are criticisms against Wilt that are valid, namely his inability to consistently win and focus more on stats than victories, but again, not all of that is on him. Even if he could have probably done some things differently. He was still an absolute dominant force that, in my mind, has to be considered a top 5 player in the history of the NBA, just off of pure dominance alone. That being said, I know that opinion probably is controversial to some, but that's just the way I see it based off of all that he could do on the court. With all that, that will conclude this video. Thank you for watching all the way through. Whether you guys agree or disagree, let me know down in the comments. Thanks again, and hope you guys enjoyed. Hey, thanks again for watching this video. If you like what you saw, go ahead and click on one of these videos here to see more.